The Bible gives out some impressive titles: David, a man after God's own heart; Abraham, the father of faith. But Moses, he's called the meekest man on earth. This is the same Moses who stood before Pharaoh, parted the Red Sea, and received the Ten Commandments. How could such a powerful leader be called meek? Isn't meekness weakness? We often picture meekness as timidity, but Moses was bold, decisive, and led millions. The Hebrew word for meek means profound humility, a strength that comes from relying on God, not oneself. Moses' meekness wasn't about lacking power. It was about knowing where true strength comes from. Raised in Egypt's palace, educated and accomplished, Moses was stripped of it all in the wilderness. For 40 years he learned humility, patience and dependence on God. When God called him, it wasn't the prince he wanted, but the humbled shepherd. Moses' story is about surrender. His life wasn't about his own glory, but about being a vessel for God's power. The Bible's description of Moses as meek is the highest compliment. He understood his place in God's story. He led not for his own kingdom, but for God's. His journey began not with a show of strength, but with the quiet acknowledgement of his own inadequacy. That humility defined his entire walk with God. Moses' greatness was rooted in surrender, not self-promotion. True meekness is strength under God's control, and that's what set Moses apart. When God called Moses from the burning bush, he didn't find a confident hero, he found a hesitant shepherd. Moses asked, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh?" He saw only his flaws, a fugitive, a stutterer, the least likely candidate. But God wasn't looking for ability, he was looking for availability. God's answer was simple: "I will be with you." Moses argued, doubted, and listed his shortcomings, but God patiently responded with promises and signs. Moses' reluctance revealed a key truth. Serving God isn't about our strength, but our willingness to depend on His. God chose Moses not for his confidence, but for his humility. Moses didn't return to Egypt because he felt ready. He went because God promised to go with him. His leadership was born from God's confidence, not self-confidence. Moses' humility made him usable. He was an empty vessel, ready to be filled. God delights in using those who know their need for him. Moses' journey began with surrender, not bravado. That's the heart God looks for. It's not about being the best, it's about being willing. Moses' story reminds us God's power is made perfect in our weakness. The greatest leaders start with a whisper of surrender, and that's where true strength begins. Moses' leadership was radically different from the world's model. Pharaoh ruled by fear and force. Moses led from his knees. In every crisis, Moses' first move was prayer, not command. When the people panicked, Moses cried out to God. When they grumbled, he sought God's guidance. He knew he wasn't the source of salvation, he was just the messenger. Moses' authority came from meeting with God, not from a throne. Leading millions through the wilderness, he absorbed complaints and carried them to God. His humility allowed God to work through him. True leadership, Moses shows us, is found in surrender and dependence on God. It's not about strategy, but about following God's lead. Moses led not by his own strength, but by trusting God every step. That's the power of meekness in leadership. Moses' meekness shone brightest as an intercessor. When Israel worshipped the golden calf, God was ready to start over with Moses. Moses could have seized greatness, but instead he pleaded for the people who had rejected him. He reminded God of his promises and appealed to his mercy. Moses put the people's needs above his own, even offering to be blotted out of God's book for their sake. This wasn't weakness, it was self-sacrificing love. True meekness is self-forgetfulness in service to others. Moses became their advocate, willing to lay down everything for them. He absorbed God's wrath so they might be spared. In that moment, Moses reflected the very heart of God. Meekness isn't about thinking less of yourself, but thinking of others first. Moses' intercession points to a love that's willing to stand in the gap. That's the strength of humility. Moses faced constant criticism, even from his own family. When Aaron and Miriam challenged his authority, Moses did nothing to defend himself. The Bible says, "Now Moses was very humble, more than anyone else on earth. He let God be his vindicator." Moses' silence wasn't weakness, it was trust. He was secure in his calling and left his reputation in God's hands. This freed him from the need to argue or prove himself. When Miriam was punished, Moses immediately prayed for her healing. He loved his critics and interceded for them. Meekness is trusting God with your defense so you can love your enemies. Moses shows us the freedom that comes from humility. You don't have to win every argument, just trust God and keep serving. That's the quiet power of meekness. Moses chose mistreatment with God's people over the treasures of Egypt. He traded a palace for a tent, comfort for calling. Why? Because he saw God's purpose as greater than worldly pleasure. Moses' humility let him value the eternal over the temporary. He lived as one of the people, bearing their burdens and serving them. He was a servant leader, pouring himself out for others. Even at the end, when denied entry to the Promised Land, Moses prayed for his people, not himself. His life was defined by what he gave, not what he gained. Moses' final concern was for the flock, not his own legacy. He chose God's people over Egypt to the very end. That's the mark of true greatness. Humility isn't about position, it's about service. Moses' legacy is a life poured out for others. Moses' life foreshadows an even greater servant, Jesus Christ. Moses left a royal position to identify with slaves. Jesus left heaven to identify with us. Moses offered to be blotted out for his people. Jesus actually bore our sin on the cross. Moses interceded for Israel. Jesus intercedes for us as our high priest. Moses led out of physical slavery. Jesus leads us out of spiritual bondage. The story of Moses is a melody. Jesus is the full symphony. Moses' humility points us to Christ's perfect meekness. To be humble like Moses is to depend on God, serve others, and choose eternal purpose over fleeting pleasure. It's to surrender our will, just as Moses did at the bush and Jesus in Gethsemane. The call to humility is a call to be like Christ. Let Moses' example point you to Jesus. Walk the path of gentle, surrendered strength. That's the legacy of true meekness.